Okay, how's it going? Still no production value this week. For that, I apologize. Today, I'm going to be talking about The Long Walk by Stephen King and why I believe it to be his most underrated book. Now, I feel like with such a bold claim, I should probably preface what exactly I mean by most underrated, which is that I believe there to be a substantial disparity between the quality of the work and the amount of widespread appraisal it has received. Essentially, I think that more people should have read the book given its high standard. Um, the Long Walk is not a book which gets talked about nearly as much as it should. And I think that when people discuss Stephen King's best works, it should at least be in the conversation. I think it's also important that I state that I have by no means read all of Stephen King's books, and that my opinion on this is potentially liable to change in the future as I read more of his work. However, as of now, I do believe that The Long Walk is his most underrated book. The Long Walk was actually the very first book he ever wrote, with him starting it whilst still in high school, which is crazy and makes me feel incredibly unaccomplished. However, it was rejected initially by a number of publishers, and this resulted in it not actually getting published until a number of years later under the pseudonym of Richard Bachman, which potentially accounts for part of why it wasn't the subject of mass fandom, such as some of his more well-known works. Another potential contributing factor is that the plot is often dismissed by those who haven't read it as 400 or so pages of people just walking, which I mean technically isn't completely false. However, I believe the circumstances and context surrounding the walk make it, at least to me, immensely interesting. If you're not familiar with the basic premise of The Long Walk, it takes place in an alternate reality totalitarian America where the biggest sport is an annual nationally televised walking competition. Essentially, well, not, I guess, a marathon in which 100 teenage boys volunteer to compete. This year's walk takes place in Maine because Stephen King, and the winner of the competition is granted literally whatever they want, indefinitely. However, much like Highlander, there can only be one, and for those who don't make it all the way to the end, there are some none too pleasant stipulations regarding the competition. The competitors must maintain a speed of greater than 4 miles per hour, and if they drop below this 3 times, they buy a ticket, which is the book's euphemism for getting shot. And they're not taken off to one side and it's done quietly. No, it is where they stand in and amongst the other competitors, nationally televised. So if that somehow wasn't enough of an indication, you should be able to tell that the book's not really for the faint-hearted. However, if you can stomach it, the troubling premise facilitates a deep exploration of a number of, at the time, and I believe still pertinent themes, as we see many of the characters undertake harrowing journeys, both physical and introspective. Particularly the protagonist, Ray Garrity, who doesn't actually know the reasons behind or why he signed up for the Long Walk, and spends much of the book coming to terms with the consequences of his decision and searching for the reasons behind it. Some aspects of the premise may have sounded rather familiar. Teenagers competing in a televised to-the-death competition. Cough, cough, Hunger Games. If you couldn't tell what I'm very subtly hinting at, the Long Walk has gone on to have a huge impact on immensely popular YA books such as The Hunger Games, which were, let's say, greatly inspired by The Long Walk. And I believe that The Long Walk has had a very obvious, long-lasting, tangible impact on the vast majority of future books in that subgenre. be it directly or vicariously through the success of books, such as The Hunger Games, which I think is a real shame given that, in my opinion, it does a much better job of executing the concept and relating books than any book which has tried since, and it was the, I believe, very first to do so, making it wholly original for its time. I think it's important that I say I in no way intend to hate on The Hunger Games in any way. I actually really enjoyed those books when they came out. It's just what I believe to be the biggest, most well-known example which best illustrates the direct influence of The Long Walk. Well, yeah, it has a really interesting concept which essentially kickstarted an entire subgenre. But what is actually good about the book if you are to pick it up today? Well, like most Stephen King books, the characters are really a strong point, with some being truly fantastic. But even the ones who aren't, they still contain a fair amount of depth and nuance, which is gradually revealed to the reader as you get further and further into the text. This is all the more distressing given that you know all but one of these characters is going to die, but you really don't want them to. This, I guess, explicit foreshadowing aptly communicates to the reader the sense of inevitability and dread and despair that you would expect someone to be feeling were they placed in such a horrible scenario. But just like the characters, you still hold an impossible futile hope that somehow your favourite character will win, or that through some Deus Ex Machinas, everyone will be spared. But one brutal, hard-to-read character death at a time, your hope is further and further crushed before your eyes. It's so painful, as King does a tremendous job of building up a strong sense of camaraderie and solidarity between the characters before he rips them away, which is very in line with the book's allegorical nature, which has been touched on a lot, so I won't address it in any depth here, but it's still important to mention. I'm not sure if King's ever actually explicitly stated it, but I think that to anyone who reads the book, it's fairly obvious that it's an allegory for war. As the reader, we see this manifest in a number of different ways. Although obvious, it's still handled delicately and tactfully, and I believe it adds a lot of, further impact to the events which transpire throughout the book. Another thing which I really love about the book is the ambiguity. There is so much to unpack and speculate on if you just dig a little deeper. Philosophical meanings behind the text, conspiracy theories surrounding the Major, character motivations, and the ending. I thought the ending was great, which, given that a pervading blight on King's career is that he can't write endings, for his best works at least, I think it lends further merit to the inclusion of The Long Walk in that discussion. There is seriously a lot to unpack here, and if you're anything like me, the book will stick with you long after you turn the final page. I also think that the book is very well paced, if not a little weirdly. On face value, the book has very slow pacing, with the majority being lengthy sections of character discussion or introspective musing. However, despite this, I found it rather difficult to put down, and how I think King achieved having it be a slow-paced page-turner is by interrupting these longer slow sections with abrupt action, usually a character death or physical hardship for Garrity to overcome. As the audience, both of which serve to evoke a sense of concern over the livelihood of our protagonist, Garrity. The former achieves a sense of escalating dread, and the latter a much more immediate concern or obstacle to be overcome. This is what I think makes it a slow page turner. Like something you feel you should look away from, but for whatever reason can't. You have to know what happens. Despite all the things I enjoyed about the book, there are several which I did not enjoy at all. Primarily, there is some weird Freudian stuff in there, which I think, in the context of the book, serves no real purpose but to make for some uncomfortable reading. To my mind, were you to take it out, the book would be none the worse for it. Following on from this, you can certainly tell it was the first book King ever wrote. There is a pervasive, distinct lack of maturity with some aspects of his writing, which again just makes for more uncomfortable reading. And the prose as a whole is, as you'd expect, nowhere near as polished as some of his later works, which wasn't at all to the book's detriment, and it couldn't be considered bad by any means. But if you are jumping back to The Long Walk from The Outsider or something, it's important to keep in mind. That all being said, I do believe The Long Walk is a fantastic book, which is fully deserving of much more appraisal than which it garners. It's a real shame more people haven't read it. Not only did it kickstart an entire subgenre, but it's an excellent book in its own regard. However, as I said before, it is a rather troubling and harrowing read, so keep that in mind if you do decide to pick it up. That's why I believe The Long Walk is the most underrated book by Stephen King. Do you agree with me? If not, what do you think is his most underrated book? Have you read The Long Walk? If so, what did you think? Let me know in the comments below. Other than that, if you've enjoyed this, like, subscribe. Peace.